Okay, thanks, ladies. Let's jump in now to our overview. So in this episode, it's going to be all about developing a thesis statement, creating an outline, and incorporating evidence into your writing. So let's get started. I'm going to transition over now to Robin.
Okay, so these are kind of the four steps that we're gonna be talking about today. So we're gonna talk about thesis first. We're gonna have you folks do a few writing exercises to kind of help you folks move towards your thesis. So a lot of times what I've seen with students is, when they're doing their research, you're a lot of times you're really focused on your sources, right? That's where you're at when you're trying to figure out what sources do I need. You're trying to read your sources, get all your information, and then when it comes time to write, sometimes it can be a little bit hard to make that transition to now focus on writing. Some students, they'll kind of get caught up in letting their sources drive their writing and saying, okay, so this source says this source says this, and I think that's not the best way, right? Once you are ready to write, I think it's a lot better to kind of be in this position where you've read all this stuff, this stuff. Now, what do you want to say after having read all this stuff and processed all this information? And so that's what we're going to start off with today. So we had asked you folks to spend about 10 minutes reviewing your notes, reviewing some of your key sources, reviewing any outlines or writing you may have already done. And now we are going to ask you to clear your desk. So, your desk or your desktop. So whatever articles or notes or writing or outlines that you have, we want to just put those away. So whether it's Xing out those windows on your computer, closing a book, and all we want you folks to have is something to write on. So maybe a blank word processing document, like your Microsoft Word or your Google Docs, or if you rather handwrite, then just like a few blank sheets of paper to just have that out. Okay, and we are gonna have a couple of writing prompts. Okay, so the first piece of writing we're gonna have you folks do is this dialogue. So I want you to imagine a dialogue partner, and ideally this is like a real person. Okay, so choose someone you think is typical of the audience you're writing for. So maybe it's your instructor, maybe it's a classmate, maybe it's a friend. I think, if you have someone that you talk to about school, that you say, that you tell about what you're working on, I think that might be a good person. You can imagine one of us if you want to as your dialogue partner telling us about your project. So you're gonna write a dialogue between you and this person about your topic. So we're gonna do kind of the quick version today. So I just have 2 questions that I want you folks to answer about your topic, right? So you imagine you tell your instructor or whoever you're imagining, I am researching social media and privacy, right? Or whatever your topic is. And you imagine they ask you, what is that? Or what, so maybe we know what social media and privacy is, right? But surely you found more. So we want you to kind of explain to them a little bit more of what is this topic and what are all the, what are some of the complicated pieces about it that not everyone might know about. And then the second question is, why is that an important topic? So, why have you chosen this topic? Why should we all pay attention to this topic? Okay, so we're gonna give you folks 5 minutes to write on that. So you can just do this on your Microsoft Word document, your word processing document, or a blank sheet of paper. Okay, so we're gonna give you 5 minutes starting right now. Go. Okay, so so I think that this piece of writing can be really helpful for thinking about what kind of information readers are going to need from you about your topic, what kind of background information that they're going to need. And if you found this helpful, you can continue this on your own time. Like I said, this is the fast version. But if you do want to try, working on it a little bit more later on, I think it's really helpful to think about, after you tell them about your topic, why it's important, and you can imagine what's the next thing that they're going to ask you, right? So what's the next question they would ask you? Maybe it's, should I be worried about my privacy on social media? And then you would write your answer to that question, and then think about what might they ask next, and just kind of write this back and forth dialogue. Okay, now I'm going to pass it off to Becca, who's going to take us through our next writing prompt.
Okay, so from this dialogue that you've kind of fleshed out between you and this hypothetical other person, whether it's your professor, your friend, really now it's making sense of that dialogue and condensing it into a few sentences, which is kind of this activity is here to gear you up towards building your thesis statement, which we'll get to in the next few slides. So basically, you're answering this question like, so what with this dialogue? So in 1 to 2 sentences for this activity, we'll give you about 3 minutes, is to summarize what you think the most important thing is that your readers should understand about your topic. So take a good look again at your dialogue and basically those 2 good questions. What is that? Why is it important? And try to condense that dialogue into a few sentences. All right, guys. So I know some of you might have just started fleshing out those 1 to 2 sentences. Oh, awesome, Jason. That's a very robust 1 to 2 sentences. That's really good. If some of yours doesn't look like that, that's okay. If some of you have written more than 1 to 2 sentences, that's good. You can always scale back. So now we're going to continue moving forward with the writing process, and we're moving forward with Robin.
Okay. Okay, so that is one, well, okay, let me just get to the next prompt. So with this one, we want you to write down your research question. Okay, we're gonna use go back to our original research question, or maybe our research question changed a little bit. Okay, hold on, my clicking is not, oh, there it is, okay. Maybe your research question changed a little bit, that's fine. If you're like, I don't remember what my research question was at all, that's fine, just make one up now. But one thing, another way we can kind of come up with a thesis statement is to think about it as the answer to our research question. Okay, so if you write down your research question, so for example, maybe if your research question was, what impact has social media had on relationships and privacy? And then we're gonna have you to think, so think about, now that you've read a bunch of sources, what would your answer be to your research question? Okay, so for our example, if we have, what impact has social media had on relationships on privacy after reading all my sources, my answer right now is social media has changed our understanding of relationships and personal information. Okay, so we're gonna give you folks a few minutes to work on that one. And again, if you would like to share in the chat room, then that would be fabulous. Okay, so our thinking with these last 2 writing prompts was that these are both, just short little pieces of writing that might help you to come up with a thesis statement. So you might be able to just pull one of those pieces of writing that you develop, like the ones that we're seeing, I think are pretty good. Or it might be combining them, or it might be choosing between the 2 things you've written. But we also want to be thinking about kind of some criteria for our thesis statement, right? To kind of evaluate, is this a good thesis statement? So some of the criteria you want to be thinking about, right, is that your thesis statement should, of course, tell readers what your paper is about. It's going to be proven or supported in your paper. So you want to be thinking about kind of the size of your thesis statement as well, right? If it's something that you can explain in 1 page, that's probably shorter than what you're being asked to write. And if it's going to take you, 30 pages, that's probably longer than what you're being asked to write. So you want to make sure your thesis statement is kind of the right size. And if it's too big or too small, you might think about how you can broaden or narrow it. Of course, you want to make sure your thesis statement is meeting any criteria your instructor has provided you. And hopefully your thesis statement is interesting, because you have to write a paper about it. Your instructor has to read this paper, and you probably don't want to bore your instructor, the person who's giving you a grade. So one way you can make your thesis statement interesting is by asserting a claim that others may agree or disagree with, right? We don't want to read a thesis and be like, duh, that's so boring. So, that's one way to kind of make it interesting. Okay, so we want you folks to kind of look at what you've written in the past too, and kind of choose or develop a thesis statement. And if you can throw it in the chat box, that would be fabulous. Okay, so hopefully you folks have some, you know, something, a draft thesis, even if you're scared to share it. We're gonna go into our breakout groups, and what we want you to do in our breakout groups, so we can adjust a little bit depending on folks, where folks are at, but we're hoping that in your breakout groups, your partners, you can share your thesis with your.
Okay, so yes, so now that you've kind of got an idea of what your thesis is or what your focus of your paper might be, the next step is then to think about, well, what kind of points are you going to include in your paper? And before you actually start fleshing out those ideas, you want to start off with a thing called an outline. So essentially, an outline is um, pres- providing a skeleton or a structure of what your paper is going to include. You can kind of think of outlines as guidelines, and they can help you see if the topics that you're thinking of including in your paper are relevant to what your thesis is. So earlier, Robin was talking about her research question was about social media and privacy. And so from there, we were able to create some sort of thesis. And the thesis here is about social media has rapidly altered our traditional understanding of relationships and personal information, making it difficult for users to fully comprehend the consequences of sharing in a world where the private is now public. So along the lines of, you know, sharing information, personal information on social media. And then one of the things that we might want to include is, you know, talking about what social media is, defining what social media is in the context of this paper, how it has altered relationships and our control over personal information, which is kind of getting to the heart of the thesis, the potential consequences of using social media without understanding its power, and then recommendations or ways to prevent and minimize those consequences. So these are a good way to see, like, how does this fit back to my thesis? Does it relate back to my thesis? And this is kind of what a sample outline might look like. Okay. So now, once you've developed that outline, you know, thinking about the points that you want to include in your paper, you're really going to have to start actually writing, right? Doing your draft. And if some of you struggle with figuring out, like, what am I supposed to put in each of my body paragraphs? Well, we're going to share with you a method, which is called meal. Oh. But before we do that, you just want to make sure that when you're fleshing out your outline, you really need to think about, okay, so if I have the topic, what evidence do I need to reinforce that topic? And then those main points, how do they relate back to the main idea, to your overall thesis? And the meal method will really help you with that if you're struggling to write. So MEAL is an acronym which stands for the main idea, example, analysis, and link. And so MEAL is, like I said, a guideline that you can use if you ever have difficulty constructing a body paragraph, but each body paragraph in your paper should be kind of like a meal. So the main idea would be the topic sentence, right? The first thing that your reader or your professor will look at for each body paragraph, and they will assume that based on that sentence, that that's what the paragraph is going to talk about, right? So if you're going to talk about defining social media in the first sentence, you don't want to talk about why chickens are cool animals in the rest of the paragraph, because then people are going to be like, what? I thought you were going to talk about defining social media. And then the next thing you would include is an example. So this is where your resources come in handy, whether it's a direct quote or you're paraphrasing information from a source that you found. This is mostly a guideline for quotes. You don't just plop the example into body paragraphs. You really want to integrate them, right? Introduce the quote into a sentence rather than just throwing the quote in there in a sentence on its own. And then after the example is your interpretation of that information, right? What does that mean? What does that information mean? What is the significance of it? So that's where your analysis comes in. And then the last thing you want to do is link all of this information back to the larger idea, which in this case is your thesis or answering your research question. And this is a nice way to round out what this specific topic and how it relates back to your thesis. And with that in mind, we're going to do a quick activity to see what meal looks like when you break it down into certain components. So continuing with the idea of social media. So one of the points for that sample outline was defining what social media is, right? What is social media? So in this section, we've color coded it for you. So the first sentence is the main idea, M, right? Social media is often associated with corporate social networking sites, but it includes much more. So that is the main idea. The second point is the example, right? We're talking about, so we're going to provide a definition, which is social media is defined as anything that allows for the sharing of information and enables the forming of human relationships across space and time. And then there's, of course, an in-text citation. And afterwards, there's an analysis, so an interpretation of this information. So this infers that any medium that allows people to socialize with one another, such as email or even the telephone, can be considered social media. And that's interpretation of the example. And then the last thing we're doing is we're going to link it back to the thesis. However, it appears that corporate social networking sites are the most prevalent in discussing how relationships have been altered as a result of social media. So now we're tying it back to the thesis, which is focusing on corporate social networking sites, which are things like Instagram, Facebook, and Snapchat. Okay, so that's kind of like the nitty gritty, the dive through meal. And now we're gonna see if you can kind of determine what those different pieces might look like. Oh, okay. So, see, oh, yeah. So here you have a series of chunks. There's five chunks. And of these chunks, I'm gonna have you input in the text box, in the chat box, what you think each of the letters are. So the first one we're going to do, the easiest one to point out, is to figure out which of these, which of 1 through 5, is the example. So type in the chat box what number you think is E. Thank you, Emily. So yes, E is example. What number do you think? So Emily says it's 4. Anybody else? Okay, Ryan also thinks it's 4. Derek, Jasmine. Okay, great, yes. So 4, overwhelmingly yes. And one of the key ways to tell that that's an example is because it's a source that's being cited. Now, following the example is an analysis. So of the 5, what do you think? Yeah, what do you think is the analysis? So we know that 4 is example. What is the analysis? I can give you guys a hint. It's more than one. Okay, so Ryan says 3 and Jason says 5. Derek says 3 or 2. Oh, interesting. And okay, good job. So actually the correct answers are 5 and 2. So the reason why it's 5 is definitely it's reiterating or it's elaborating further on the example, saying this confirms that couples do not discuss their personal expectations, which is kind of saying like, well, what's so important about this example? And then the for instance is kind of expanding upon what Rhodes et al. Might be talking about, which is another form of analysis. Okay, so now that we've gotten E and A, we're stuck with M and L. So, okay, so now which of 1 or 3 is the main idea? Everyone says it's 1. Okay, good job, guys. That is correct. So that would be the start of the body paragraph, saying like research suggests that the reason why first-time cohabiting relationships fail is XYZ. Good job. So then that leaves the last one, the link, which is 3, right? So it just cycles back, reiterates the lack of communication is one of the contributing factors to fallout in cohabitation. So it might just be that the thesis is about factors that relate to fallout when people live together. And this is what it looks like when you piece it actually together in a body paragraph. So again, we have M, which is the main idea, the example, the analysis. So yes, the analysis can be more than one sentence. You don't have to limit yourself to just one sentence. And then of course, you always want to link it back.
Okay, so at this point, we want you, so we're almost done. We're kind of getting to our wrapping up. So we wanted to kind of bring up this slide again for you folks to think about kind of the 4 pieces that we shared with you folks today that are probably the steps that you need to go through, you know, from when you're done reading your sources or you've read a bunch of your sources until you have a draft. So we talked about the thesis and developing a thesis. Hopefully we gave you some strategies that you find useful and for evaluating your thesis. We practiced, you had an opportunity to get a little bit feedback on what people might expect to hear in your paper and see a sample outline. And then we gave some quick tips for drafting as well as Meal as a tool that you might use in your drafting. Okay, so we're hoping that as you folks move forward, you kind of have these 4 steps, you know, to kind of think about, okay, do I have my thesis? Do I have my outline? Okay, now I'm ready to draft. If I'm stuck, I can use Meal as a tool. And as I said, you know, we had to do kind of a quick version here. So if you do need more help with any of these steps, definitely feel free to make an appointment with a tutor as well. And am I throwing it to Natalie now? Okay.
All right, so that just about wraps up episode number 3, our outlining and writing workshop.